Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar with FASD Hub Scotland. Thank you so much for joining us. We are dead on 8 o'clock, so I'm just going to allow people like a minute or so to join. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. We're excited for our guest tonight, and I'm sure it's going to be very informative and everybody's going to gain a lot from it. So let's just give ourselves, maybe another minute. If you would like to use the chat function, please feel free to introduce yourselves, pop your name in the chat. As I say, on every webinar we do, we only have an hour, so we have a full packed agenda and we have pre-submitted questions. But Gemma, who's joining me this evening to co-host, will be monitoring the chat and she will be looking at the questions alongside any questions that we've had pre-submitted. So she may jump in and ask our wonderful guest some questions, should they be appropriate throughout the evening. Oh, I can see lots of people from all over Scotland,
Yeah,
Wales,
yeah.
Newcastle,
Canada,
Canada.
Canada this evening as well.
Well, we've got a huge selection of people, so welcome everybody. So I think therefore, as I can see the chat going crazy, I think for all of you, I should pretty swiftly move on and start the webinar. So I'm delighted to welcome our guest this evening, Dr. Maude Champagne, who is an award-winning neuroscientist, social worker, and therapist who's received national recognition for her design and implementation and evaluation of multiple programs supporting complex families. She is highly sought after as a bilingual trainer in areas of FASD, attachment, trauma, and childhood aggression. And her mission is to provide resources to professionals and families of children with multiple complexities that will improve their quality of life and overall well-being. And I think somebody posted to me on my LinkedIn Maud's book, and that sparked my interest. I don't know, I can't even remember who it was, but I just remember very vividly saying to Gemma, oh, I just got this link to this person, and that's how
Mhm.
this all came about. And I just randomly approached Maud on LinkedIn. Thankfully, she got back to me. I'll let her tell you more when I hand over to her this evening. Um, and this evening, we're going to be talking about decoding aggression, complex behaviours, and brain-based disabilities. So, a big topic that many of us will experience, but I think we should hand over to the professionals. So thank you, Maude, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me and for everyone who's coming tonight. Like Joanne said, I wear a lot of hats. I do research, I do clinical practice, but I'm also a parent of 5 children. Three came to me by adoption. So I also like to say that I also have the lived experience, not of FASD, but of adopting children with multiple complexities. And I guess that's how I became passionate about this topic tonight that we'll be talking about. Well, now I'm seeing myself. And so I'm a fairly casual presenter. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please ask them in the chat or in the section question and response, question and answers. And I'll have a PowerPoint, but I think there's time for questions too at the end that were prepared in advance. So just to, I guess, set the stage, what we're talking about today is about aggression towards family members during child and adolescence, difficult behaviors basically that are compromising the safety of caregivers, of siblings, people with who take care of our young people. And I just want to make sure that when I present to groups or parents who are caring for individuals with FASD, I just want to make sure that you understand I'm not saying that everybody with FASD have aggressive behaviors or dangerous behaviors, but there's certainly the fact that their brains are different and they're more at risk for severe emotional dysregulation and difficult behaviors. And this is kind of what we're going to talk about tonight and how we can support all family members. So I will share my PowerPoint and I will also send it to to your host tonight, so you have the PowerPoint after. Okay, here it is. Okay. So first, and I just want to say we only have an hour, so there's might be a few things that I'm skipping or going over a little bit quicker than usual, but that's okay. Ask your question. So first, I want to talk about what is it that we're talking about tonight? What do I mean by AFCA? Because I'll use this acronym quite a bit. And why do we need to talk about this? So in Scotland, also in Australia, there's several countries where what we talk about as AFCA. In Canada, I think your countries usually use the acronym CPVA or CPA, which stands for child to parent aggression or child to parent abuse. And a few years ago, actually during COVID, I was a therapist supporting individuals with FASD and supporting their families. And we also saw a lot of caregivers reporting that their children, due to lack of support, due to not having the same routine as before the COVID pandemic, reported very high level of aggressive behaviors in their children, and that was compromising their safety. So we start looking at what else, how do people call this in other countries? And we saw that in certain countries, they were calling it CPVA, child to parent violence and aggression, but it did not feel comfortable to us in our country. Parents were not liking it. Therapists were not liking it, mostly because it felt like we were blaming the child. At the same time, parents were like, but if I just say, oh, my child's dysregulated, the therapist will think my kid is jumping on the couch. And that's not, as you all know, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about behaviors that could compromise the safety of all family members, the emotional safety, physical safety. And usually these challenges stems from difficulties with self-regulation. And then the bigger question is like, why do they have such difficulties with self-regulation? It's rarely one answer. Usually it's prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol, exposure to trauma before or after birth. It could be genetic factors, but it's quite, that part is quite rare. It could also be mental illness that are comorbidities of prenatal exposure, for example. So there's many factors of why the child has self-regulation issues, but it's always the same root at its core. And I think it's also important to talk about how much this is a spectrum when we're talking about difficult behaviors, or even what people describe in the FASD world as challenging behaviors. Sometimes it's like just the win, right? Could be a small tantrum at the store, could be, throwing a toy once in a while. And then you could have like a bigger storm where, they're screaming, maybe calling you names. And then you have a tornado where, someone was injured, probably. It sort of leaves devastation behind. And the tornado, if you think about it, if you even consider that metaphor, it's usually multifactorial. It's never one factor that makes a storm turn into a tornado. And if you're thinking about that as well, is you cannot leave a family who just experienced a tornado to recover alone. We need a community to help people recover from these events. So just keep that metaphor in mind, because I think it's important to sort of like um, consider how these events can impact family members. So basically, if you've heard CPVA before, if you've heard CPA, child parent abuse, when I use AFCA, it's the same thing. It's just the name that we're using in Canada. And there's a lot of research, growing research on it, and how can we help families who are experiencing these difficult behaviors. So a few years ago, my PhD was on how to support families who have children with FASD, and about their which interventions will work. And more specifically, which intervention will work if we have this level of tornado. Okay. And the first step for us was to understand the experience. So in my work, so I'm both a clinician and a researcher. So in my work, I support families who have been through these experiences. So I hear from it in my research, but I hear about their experience in my work as well. And I think to some degree, I don't think I've hit in my parenting experience like the extreme tornado that I've seen in some of the families that I am supporting, but I've had big storms in my life also as an adoptive parent. And something that I want to share is, while in every family the experience is unique and different, the emotional experience is extremely similar from one family to another. I would say from one caregiver to another. And I think it's important to understand that emotional experience, to understand how to best support ourselves and how to best support the caregivers that we are supporting, if you're a professional as well. So I will go over some of these feelings, I guess, and feel free to even in the chat write maybe like not like a big story, but yes or no, like if this is something you've been through as a parent in some situations. So one thing that we have heard from a lot of families is the isolation that they are experiencing when there's aggression in the home. It's hard to ask for help. Parents are often being blamed about their child's behavior. And I mean, I'm no expert on the culture in UK and Scotland, but in Canada, usually the way we assess parental capacity is by looking at the child's behavior. But if the child has neurodevelopmental disorders, complex developmental trauma, FASD, you name it, you cannot assess your parental capacity by looking at your child's behavior, because you're going to feel doomed. You have to assess your parental capacity by how you respond, by the services you're trying to gather for your child, by the support you're receiving from others, as well as your own way to develop resilience. So where I'm going with that is that I think a lot of us have been burned by professionals or by services that are supposed to help us, because of the shame that we may experience when trying to access those services. Sorry. And that brings to isolation, because we don't necessarily want to reach out to people, or we don't really want to have people over because we'll be judged. We'll have unwelcome advice maybe. And so what it leads to very often in some families is actually an increase in aggressive behaviors. Not always, but what we've seen is that violence usually grows in secrecy. This is something that I've learned from actually other professionals in the UK. The other part too, I would say, is the hopelessness, like feeling like I'm trying to be hopeful, but actually things are getting worse. I'm being judged, behaviors are escalating, you're in crisis, you try to reach out, it's never the right service. Very often what happens here in Canada anyway is that parents will ask for help to, let's say, child protection services, and they will assess their capacity and say, you're fine and we don't have resources for you. And that just actually brings more stress on the family. And sometimes they will send them to parental training when actually the parents that I work with are extremely competent, could give the class. Um, it's also the sense of helplessness. Like I think a lot of parents would say, I want to maybe we're not strict enough, maybe we're too strict. So then one parents become like parents sometimes when there's two parents, they become very polarized because one is like trying to like calm the young person who escalates a lot or give in to some of these behaviors out of fear or provide more accommodations, for example. And the other parent's like, wow, this is getting out of control. So they get more rigid. And these are patterns that are really difficult as parents to get out of without professional help because we I would say that most professionals they would say, oh, like you need to set more boundaries, but they don't consider that when a parent is trying to set boundaries in these contexts, it could be very dangerous. It's not, we're not talking about just felt safety, how the parents feel. It's actually about uh, concretely about practical safety as well. And that's sometimes not considered in what we do. There's a lot of grief involved of what's a normal family. Um, should we do Christmas or celebrate the holidays as, all our kids together? Can we visit our relatives? Is that safe to do so? What if we can't? What if we cannot have the child living in the home anymore? Um, and a big sense of stagnation, this is something that I realized recently where it seems like some families have been in crisis for so long that they're sort of like stuck with um thinking of like what's the next life skill I could teach to my child or what's the next project. It's like they're just trying to extend a fire here, there's a fire here to attend, another fire there. um and so it's really hard to at some point um stop being a fire like a first responders, right? You were trying to get out of this crisis and go back to, okay, what are my goals, what are my values, what am I comfortable with, and even ourselves as caregivers make sure we have our own basic needs met. And tonight actually I don't want to be pessimistic when I talk about this experience, but I think it's important to um, validate how extreme that experience can be, and to also realize that, yes, we want to support children who have a brain-based disability, some of them complex trauma, prenatal exposure, but that children don't recover if parents are not taken care of. And if that's their experience, emotional experience, and it's not addressed. I'm just gonna quickly also look at the chat because I see that there's I'm not seeing it anymore. But feel free, Gemma or Joanne, like to interrupt me and ask questions or comments. Because when I'm sharing, I'm not seeing the chat anymore.
Thank you. Yeah, I've just asked everyone to make sure they've set their comments to who they want it to be sent to, because we've had quite a lot come through just to us as hosts. So if you do want to share it with everyone, so the whole group can read, if you set it to everyone. There's just a lot of agreement with what you're saying, and I think it's really relating to a lot of people and their own situations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's actually in a child's program, but it says, maybe you've heard it before. It says we say name it to tame it. So when we have a big emotion, if we actually even name it or validate that feeling, it brings some relief. So sometimes when we think about big behaviors, the system's like, okay, recognize the triggers, think about this, think about that. But what about, just at least validate the story of caregivers. And also something that I started doing by realizing, and that was also my experience as a caregiver, is we're not being believed very often. They think we're exaggerating. And that's something also that a lot of women would say, I had to send my male partner, for example, so they believe him more than they believe me. And that's something we still experience in Canada. I don't know in your country. Um, but just to tell caregivers, I believe you, goes a long way. So the impact on caregivers, and when I send a PowerPoint, I will also send you a research. I was talking about this research to Gemma and Joanne before we start the webinar. It's a research, it's called filial trauma. So that's basically the trauma we experience as caregivers. It's more about the adoption trauma than the FASD part, but I think it very much applies. So it's basically different than secondary or vicarious trauma, because that trauma is in our home. It's not like we go to work. Oh, you appeared, Gemma. So it's like you're going to work and then you come back and you can get some rest. Like it's 24/7. And it's how you feel in your role as parents. For most of us, what we value the most is our role as mom or dad. We value this relationship. It's very important. And when this is impacted and we don't feel competent in that life domain, it's extremely traumatic.
I think everything you're saying there, like, really, really touches a chord about being believed, particularly not just professionals, but yeah, it can be very, very similar over here as well. And I think that was maybe one of the questions that came up tonight, was about how do we, it's one of the fights that we fight, you know, every day, every week, of getting professionals to listen and getting them to believe, and but just getting them to understand. How do we, you know, because a lot of the time we try and, you know, educate the educators or find the right words, and that's something that I think everybody is touched by, that sense of either not being believed, or, you know, they're not finding the right words, or they're just simply not getting the support that
And
they
I
need.
think there's like a great comment in the chat where somebody said, I believe you is not something that social workers would say to a parent in England. And obviously Gemma's in Scotland, I'm in England, but and she says that's just my experience with 13 social workers and counting. And I'm like, you know, I have two adopted children. My eldest is nearly 21, and my experience is the same. I believe you is not something I have ever heard. I've heard everything that somebody else wants to put in place. So I think it's quite powerful just by looking at the chat. It's just
Yeah.
like,
Everyone's reaction to it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm. And I also saw the comment about trauma and FASD and how they want to put it on the trauma and not the FASD. And that's a very good comment. So I won't answer that now, but I'm going to keep it in the back of my mind for the next of the presentation.
Brilliant.
Mhm.
And, you know, when I say that, it sounds like, oh, that's just so sad, you know, to say that. But I think these are, you know, we've been so focused on changing the child's behavior, and ideally that would be great. But if we are not able to, then can we at least support the parent in their experience?
Yeah.
And we're not subhuman as caregivers. You know, we do need to have these feelings validated and be supported in what we do. So, like, for example, respite. I know all countries struggle to receive respite that is adequate for our children, and changing sort of like how we see things. Like most of the parents that I meet, they feel extremely ineffective and inadequate in their parenting role, and they're actually unbelievable parents. Are amazing, but they need to sort of like reconnect with their feeling of being effective, and sometimes it's through peer support. You know, we do support groups. We use nonviolent resistance. I know it's very popular in the UK. That's how I learned about NVR with Alcodes and Partnership Projects UK. And they said, you know, you have to do those groups because they see one another. And most parents have kids with FASD. It's usually the ones that are falling through the cracks, I would say. And seeing other parents that are like smart, competent, but they're struggling with the same things, it brings some kind of relief. Not that they're happy that, oh yeah, they're going through the same problems, but you're like, okay, I'm not alone. That's a big piece. And I'm not crazy. Like they are struggling as much as I am.
Yeah.
Um, And that's something I think we can't necessarily find necessarily with our friends who have not had the parenting experience of either having a child with neurodevelopmental disabilities or attachment injuries and along those lines. Before we do this, I will just add a note of why this is more complex maybe for FASD than another disability. We have, as you know, in Canada, we have a lot of research on FASD compared to most countries. I mean, if we talk to a Canadian, they'll say there's not enough. And I agree with that, but we have more than the average, I guess. So the difficulties with diagnosis, it's very difficult to obtain a diagnosis in most countries, especially if you're a birth parent. The amount of comorbidities, like more than 400 comorbidities of mental health and physical disabilities, the sleep problems. We also know from research, if you compare even autism and FASD, the parents who have a child with autism struggle way more in terms of the stress they experience. And it's very often because their children have a certain level of trauma as well. And it's quite stigmatized in the system to say that you have FASD. So basically, why your child is struggling is difficult to talk about. And there's a lot less resources in most systems to support young people and families who have a child with FASD instead of other disabilities. So that's why it's sort of like making it more difficult to respond to FASD rather than other developmental disabilities. So it's adding to, sometimes people think, oh, AFCA, CPVA, it's a family problem. It's not. Yes, it's happening within the home, but very often in the community. And if these families were well supported and there were more prevention, quite possibly we wouldn't get to the same level of crisis. So AFCA is also very systemic and it needs a systemic response. So this is from my PhD and this is also in my book. So when you're thinking of the risk factors for aggressive behaviors and FASD, around that, you have the systemic barriers that I just mentioned, lack of understanding of FASD, the shame and the blame of birth mother, the shame and the blame of caregivers, of the young person too, who has brain-based disabilities and displays these inappropriate behaviors. It's also the negative outlook that we have over their life trajectory. A lot of clinicians will refuse to see people with FASD. They think they cannot change their behaviors at all. They think no intervention will work. It's all that negative stuff that is talked about. And it's true. It's difficult to change the behavior of someone with FASD, but it is possible to improve their well-being. It's possible to improve their functioning. It just needs a different approach. So we keep that in the back of our mind. So when I talk about systemic barriers, and it shouldn't rely all on parents, but it's usually parents who are doing advocacy, but that's why we need better advocacy to respond to AFCA, to these aggressive behaviors in childhood and adolescence. So I'm sorry, it's very small, but it was kind of like impossible to make it bigger because there's so many things here. We will not cover all of it, okay? But there's certain things that I want to talk about that I think if you've done a lot of FASD training, maybe you don't hear about it as much, okay? So I'm not sure where it is, but okay, hostile attribution bias. Okay, this is also, I talk about it in my book. Hostile attribution bias is very common in FASD. It's also very common in attachment injuries and trauma. So it's basically anytime the parent set a boundary or an adult set a boundary towards the child thinks it's not out of love and concern. So if my child, we have good attachment, a good relationship, and I say, you skipped school today, I'm going to take away your phone or your video games, you're grounded for a certain amount of days. my child who's neurotypical and that has good attachment with me will be like, I'm mad, but they'll accept and understand a certain level of, they mean well and I have done something wrong. Maybe they'll even try to apologize. When you have a child who has hostile attribution bias, they will think you're mean, it's not fair, you're the only one doing things like that. They will push hard to say this is wrong. They don't think you mean well. And this is happening. So it's towards the end, like psychological and affective factor. So hostile attribution factors are actually, bias is something you can work on in psychotherapy with people with FASD. Even if they have attachment, even if they have trauma, even more so. And beyond the therapy, there's some tips that you can use. So for example, having as many carers, adults in your child's life to remind them that rules are here to protect you. If your parent said that, it's out of love and concern. Just constant reminder of why we set these boundaries. And over time, that could lead to change in perspective. Yes, Gemma, do you have a question?
I was just going to jump in to say that I don't know about anybody else, but I'm sitting here going, there's a name for that. I've never heard of that. And that, I mean, to say that rings a bell is such an understatement. And it just feels, yeah, it's amazing to actually have a proper term for that. I think a lot of people here will relate to that.
And that's something that can be changed, because I've seen it change in so many young people, but over time. It's not like you say it to your child once, and
No,
usually it needs to come from other people
it's
because
something that it's
they
been
don't
a
think
really big main factor in my life as a parent. My daughter's almost 12, but I've never actually had and it has changed, and there's a lot of a lot of improvement, but I've never had a name for it, so thank you for that. Oh yes, there was somebody else. Light bulb moment. Yes, Ailish, absolutely.
yeah, to be
I had
honest,
one
for me
too.
too.
At last, a name for this, says
It's
Adrienne.
funny, isn't it, that suddenly somebody gets a name and they're
That's
like, oh my gosh,
exactly what
they
it
feel
is.
like validated in their journey
Yeah,
parenting.
amazing.
And
Amazing.
I think honestly, when I meet parents, I see it all the time. Unless they have a child with like quite severe autism, they're nonverbal, so you don't really know what the child's thinking. But for most, when you hear the child's perspective, that's what they think. And I had, so what I'm going to share here is not really based on research, but from discussions with other clinicians who are experts at FASD and trauma and attachment. We think, because even if they grow up in very positive household, okay, let's say they're adopted as babies and they have all those diagnoses like FASD, they're still very much in trouble all the time. Like they're jumping on stuff, they're too loud, they're dysregulated. So they're always in trouble. And even with like the parents trying to provide the right accommodations, it's tough. Like it's very tough. I know I'm an adoptive parent. I have kids with special needs. Like you don't sleep well, you're exhausted, you're trying this and that, it's not working, and then the people like try this, try that, and it's exhausting. And
And
you're
You look
literally
even
everywhere.
when
You
just
look
you,
like,
everywhere for the answer.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think even
yeah.
when you have like a really great day, a positive day, especially if you've got a child with like FASD, but with comorbidities of ADHD and ASD and intellectual disability and other stuff going on, what I find as a parent is like the great days are great, but then the ADHD like takes over to such an extreme amount that you're like, oh, I just need a break because they've got so excited that it's been a good day that heart just suddenly comes out like, where did that come from? But
Yeah.
and you can never explain it and you can't even really predict it, I don't think. I think it's like something you sort of live with and go, oh, okay, calm now.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue for that question that you was sent to me in the document you had. So people will ask, why is it happening out of the blue? Like they go from 0 to 100. We hear that all the time. But from a research perspective, they're never at 0. Actually, never, none of us are actually at 0. But so let's say my baseline in terms of stress, maybe it would be, I don't know, 70. But for someone with FASD, it's maybe 90 or 95, like their regular baseline. We know that. And the other thing too is that let's say they are like 90, something happens, they're not going back to their baseline right away. They stay up much longer. So that's why they're more vulnerable to trauma and stress. They don't recover the same way. Let's say I have a car accident. And like this is like, let's say a minor car accident, it's aggravating. And then I try to calm down. Maybe I'll go for a walk. The next day I'm fine. But for someone with FASD, it stays in their body much longer. So when parents are like, okay, my child goes from 0 to 100 or professionals, it's not true. It's like they're already way up
They're
there,
already
but
like on
maybe
a
you
higher
don't see
level.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's also that, we're like, okay, is it trauma? Is it FASD? Is it ADHD? I have yet in 20 years to meet someone with FASD who doesn't have ADHD. Like it's kind of like part of the symptoms, really.
Yeah.
And most of them will have some level of trauma because how they experience microaggression daily because of their interactions, that people don't understand them really well. They don't necessarily know what accommodations they should provide. Their relationships are difficult. And also many of them, because they have the narrative that we don't mean well. It's actually traumatic, right? So it's like, is it the chicken or the egg? Doesn't matter. I call it brain-based disability. Their brains are different, and it's shaped by prenatal exposure to stress. Alcohol could also be trauma. And it's true that sometimes it's problematic that professionals will focus so much on trauma. And most programs on trauma are focusing on recovery. So if you think of, and I'm also an attachment therapist, so I'm trained in dialectic developmental psychotherapy, DDP. I did my master's on DDP and how it can be used for FASD, and it can actually be really good, but only if there's a problem with the attachment. So for example, they were adopted older, and only if there's no severe aggression in the home. When there's severe aggression in the home, actually it could be harmful because we're asking the parent, sit down with your child, enjoy your child, play with your child, but the parent is not safe, not just emotionally. Very often they're not physically safe. So what we try to do in Canada now is to do NVR and have as many things in place as possible to bring back safety. And then if it's still an issue, then we might do attachment therapy. It's something else that I'd like to mention. What time is it? Okay. Something else that I think I'd like to mention is actually, I'm going to show you guys a slide for people who are visual, it's just easier. Oh, see, that was he's so mean, she doesn't care, he's selfish. That's the hostile attribution bias. Just never really use my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, accommodation versus accommodations. And this is something I took from the space program. I don't know if you guys heard of the space program. It's a program that is adapted based on some nonviolent resistance principles, but to help parents of children with severe anxiety and OCD. And something I've noticed in my practice is many professionals don't want to deal with the anxiety of people with FASD, or if they deal with it, it's by avoiding. So we think sometimes we provide an accommodation, but we may over accommodate. Okay, so and that's a really tricky one. Okay, so if you're not paying attention, pay attention now, because this is like a harder one. Okay. I'll give you some very specific example. Okay. So maybe you've seen videos of him, Emilrick. Anyway, I don't say his name right. It's someone with FASD in Canada. He gives conferences. He was talking about how difficult it is for him to go on planes. And over accommodation would be, you're too anxious to go on planes. We're not going anymore. an actual accommodation that he made for himself is he's wearing a hoodie because of the noise. He's wearing headphones, and he's also struggling with the smell, so he wears his own cologne. So what he does is he's providing himself some accommodation so he's able to go on the plane. We usually have over accommodations when the world of the child is getting smaller, smaller, smaller. Or it's they do it by kind of like force or threats. I'll give you an example. So let's say the child wakes up in the middle of the night. It's hard for him to eat anything, and he wakes up his parents, he's 12, and he says, "You go bring me food at McDonald's. Okay? If you don't do it, I will punch you in the face." That's going to McDonald's at that time is not an accommodation for FASD. It's an over accommodation. It's made out of, I feel forced to do it. I'm trying to avoid an escalation. And okay, so, and when I say that, I'm not saying that if at some point you were in the situation, you said yes to protect yourself, there's no judgment here. We do what we can to protect ourselves, but that's not the proper accommodation necessarily for FASD. So, and I think that's where I would say, even for me as a professional, and even as a parent, it's like trying to figure out, okay, like, am I accommodating my child's disability here, or am I over accommodating to avoid an escalation? Sometimes it's good, but sometimes, we spend so much time looking at a trigger here, a trigger there, but the trigger is like, you said hi, you did not say hi the right way, you didn't cut the toes properly, could be anything. So we want to make sure that the needs of all family members are also recognized and acknowledged and met. Most parents that I see when they're in the crisis, the thick of the crisis, they have many, many, many unmet basic needs of sleep, of peace, of quiet. And they feel like they only live for their child to accommodate their disability and to support them. And many of them will even have like a loss of identity. So, so what we try to do is to stop looking at all the triggers, but more going with what is it that I do for my child that is a proper accommodation? What is it that might be an over accommodation? And that in the long term, I'm actually not helping my child, and I'm not helping myself too. Yeah, being held to ransom. Yeah, pick your battles come to mind. Yeah, I feel like that's so tricky sometimes to feel like, am I picking my battles? We do this process and in VR, right? We're like small basket, medium, and large. And most professionals, I think, will think, okay, we're gonna address what's most dangerous. But some parents are like, no, like what I would like right now is to get my sleep. So how are we gonna do something to make sure that you're actually sleeping and that there's no over accommodation, during the night, for example?
Yeah, I think that's like very common when you support families like within the hub, Gemma and I and all of the team. And we use that saying quite a lot with families, like pick your battles, like, when parents are so overwhelmed with so many things, it's like, what is the most important thing? Is it that they get a shower, or is it that they're safe and they protect themselves in a way that, they can cross a road or drive a car or ride a horse or something? It's quite a tricky thing to navigate, working out how to ease the pressure on parents and caregivers, but also to ensure that children understand the importance of these things, I think.
Mm-hmm. And from one parent to another, like let's say there's two parents in the home, they may not have the same priorities.
Yeah.
right? Like based on how we were raised, and like also even if we are in the same home, that both parents will have a very different experience of the child. Sometimes there's better attachment with one parent versus another. And sometimes that's based on their trauma or all sorts of perceptions. Um, and so it feels tricky as a can shift depending on how overwhelmed my child is in the moment.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and yes, this is what I mean. It's extremely tricky. I don't want to present this as, oh yeah, just do that, you know. That's why there's no answer here. There's questions. And now, you know, I try to sort of like ask these questions with the parents and like, okay, when it feels forced, when it's out of threat, is that really an accommodation? And what else can we do instead? And like we want to pick our battles, but what we've seen happening in Canada anyway is that we had families who were experiencing a lot of aggressive behaviors. So the child basically had no chores. There was no times to teach life skills. We're just trying to avoid escalations. And then there's no more aggressive behaviors. We do certain things. And then the child turns 18 and there's no plan in place. And they have no life skills because they've never emptied the dishwasher because we could not ask for anything. Right. So now we're like, okay, we need to know who else can help us teach life skills to our kids. Who else can help us not over accommodate? Who else can give us more courage when we need to say no and we know we need to say no? Not just courage, but safety, like real safety. So if they escalate in the car all the time, I have parents, they have to take the train with a support worker or with a friend with their child. It's too dangerous to drive. And that's hard. That's part of the grief, right? So that's not an over accommodation. You're actually accommodating safety for the parent, not for the child.
Yeah,
It's
and don't you think it's like for the parent, it's like forward planning? Because I think as a parent, automatically you just go, I'm going to do, because I think as a parent, very often from my lived experience, what you do is you try to do it to avoid a consequence, to avoid a
the
failure for
confrontation.
your child, to avoid anything. And I have an almost 16-year-old and have recently got somebody in to just help with travel training, just to help her get on a train and buy a ticket. And the person that I've got to help her is somebody I know who's only, I don't know, 6 years older than my daughter, but has a completely different relationship than me. So for me, I'm mum and I'm annoying.
Yeah. And you don't
For
know what you're
my,
talking
I
about.
don't know what
And
I'm
they're not.
talking about. And I'm like, I always try and jump in too quick because I just don't want her to feel bad. But
Yeah.
having somebody go with her who is, of a similar age, of a similar peer group, of a similar interest, who she likes, who has the time to do this and sort of employ her at my cost as a PA means that my own daughter has a successful experience in something that I would love to say I'm brilliant at, but I think just by nature of being her mum, I probably don't always do things right that would help her. And I think it's quite a hard step for a parent to just try and go, right, what is what is really needed for my child and am I always the most appropriate person to do it, even though I am definitely the person who wants the success and will support to the end. I think as a parent, it's very easy to feel like you've failed if you can't do it,
Yeah.
or if you're not the appropriate person to do it for the child at their age.
There's a really another example in the chat there of somebody, again, it's sort of picking your battles and how hard it is and how complicated just as, and one issue could be. An example we have was we avoided a blue badge as we wanted to teach road safety. 2 years on and some recent near misses with her lunging in front of cars, we have had to bite the bullet and get the badge. So yeah, even one issue can be incredibly tricky to know.
It's tricky for parents, isn't it? Because all parents want is that their kids are safe and being able to, have the best outcome ever. And I think generally we just want them to be able to integrate into society. And it's a journey to realize that to do that, they can, but accommodations are required. And if you put the accommodations in and you put in the support and the scaffolding, then there's more chance that they will be able to achieve success, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Gillian said as
True.
well that it also this kind of reminds me of the spiky profile, I guess, and how it can go up and down. Same with this. So accommodations, it said they can shift depending on how overwhelmed the child is in that moment, how their window of tolerance is. And I would add to that, Gillian, how overwhelmed we're feeling and how big our window of tolerance is, and everything else that's going around. So I think you're constantly having to evaluate, aren't you? Do I accommodate? Do I over accommodate? I maybe did things one way yesterday, but maybe today that's not quite, the right support. Yeah.
So I think it would be really good if I could ask a couple of questions
Yeah.
that, I mean, I think you've pretty much covered like most of our questions, but there are some that I think you could probably give some real nuggets of like one line things that our families
Mhm.
could use. So we have one question that was, how do we explain that aggression is a response to unmet needs and not intentional defiance? And I think that comes from a parent who was trying to explain this to a professional to say, you know, no, they're not aggressive. This has happened because of this. So I think it would be really beneficial to our audience to find language, because I think as parents and carers, it's very easy to become overwhelmed, and then ultimately that turns into dysregulation for the parent, who then can't calm their own brain to speak to a professional in a manner where they're taken serious, and they're, as a parent, I think we all believe that the parent knows the child best, but I think sometimes finding the language for the parents can be hard in really stressful situations. So having those golden nuggets of like one-liners that they can put into their professional conversations is incredibly powerful for them, even if they write them down or learn them before they go in. So that would be really great.
I don't have those lines. I wish I did, but I don't. I would say what comes to mind when I when you share that, it's more like what we do where I work is we really encourage parents to, whenever you send an email, CC one of us as professionals. If you have a school meeting, go with a professional. It's sad to say, but as parents, we are not heard many times. I mean, I have more letters beside my name than in my name, and they don't care when I'm there as a parent. So I do bring a professional very often. Um, and if it's not to be heard, it's to be more regulated. So I feel more like grounded, maybe that, we can have a productive conversation as much as possible. I send information that is on websites, short videos. If you go look on the at where I work in Ontario, we have a YouTube page, Interwoven Connections, and there's a caregiver series, and there's a lot of information on FASD and other topics. So sometimes sending outside information. I don't necessarily like the phrase it comes from an unmet need, because I think it sort of like oversimplifies it. It's not necessarily always an unmet need, in my opinion. Um, so, and I'm not meaning, I don't mean like, oh, interwoven connections,
Mhm.
communications. I can send you the link after. So I'm trying to give an example here. Um, I can't come up with the quick examples, but I think it's kind of oversimplifying it. I think once people understand it's a brain-based disability, always going back to the disability factor is important, that we don't necessarily see it, but it
Yeah.
needs addressed and supported.
And another question we had, like I'm just going through a few questions that I think maybe we haven't covered, is why does aggression often escalate at bedtime, even when routines and sleep hygiene are good?
Over 90% of people with FASD have sleep issues. So I know most parents who have children with FASD have very good sleep routine and are very careful about screen time and all these things. And yet the child struggles with sleep. And we know that lack of sleep aggravates behavioral problems, even for us as parents. It aggravates how we feel and how we might be able to emotionally regulate. Um, so there's that, but also, yeah, just feeling tired in the evening. So like sometimes we look so closely at prenatal exposure to alcohol, what are the factors? But if you don't look so close and you look at what, generally speaking, will lead someone to use aggression, being tired, feeling too hot, being hungry, interpreting the situation as hostile. These are factors that it applies to people with FASD as well. So it could be that they're tired.
Okay, so I have one like big final question, I think. So, um, with adopted children, so many times we hear from parents and families that we support that all of their behaviors or all of their symptoms are explained as trauma and attachment. Um, Even when those families are going through the process to seek a diagnosis and have evidence of prenatal alcohol exposure. So, what would you advise them to have within their language bank to discuss with professionals about what distinguishes FASD related behaviors and symptoms that are linked to prenatal alcohol exposure that differ from just the trauma and attachment words that are often put out there to families?
Well, for those who likes to read academic stuff, in my dissertation, doctoral dissertation, and I could send you the link. There's a section on the complexity of addressing behavioral issues in that context. So like FASD and trauma and attachment injuries, because it's like the brain is way more complex than this is the FASD part that's affected. This is the attachment stuff. That's not how it works, right? So it's like we're complex humans. So for me, it's never like, okay, let's look at one thing. We try to look at the person as in a holistic way, even like the things that are positive, that are actually good about the person, their humor, and what they struggle with. And most people with FASD also have some levels of, like I said before, of trauma. I think the problem becomes when we put so much pressure on parents to make their child recover from the trauma when they have a brain-based disability that's permanent here.
Mm.
And no matter the level of co-regulation that you do and therapies, they're still going to struggle.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of like, where do you put your efforts? And again, it's kind of like over accommodation and accommodation. It's not an easy question to answer, but I think like as parents, we try so hard to figure it out and find the next best thing. But I think my key message is not to forget ourselves in that process. And I think the next phase of my work, and if you go on my website, I have a blog and I've been writing extensively now about, not extensively, I have like 3 blog posts, but anyway, like talking about the recovery in the parent and how we need to take care of ourselves. It's far from being easy when we're.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing. And I think for our community and our parents that have been here today, I can just see by the chat that there's like just such huge interest. And I think it would be great if you could send us all your
I
links, and
will. I will.
Gemma's already posting, I can see in the chat. And we've posted your book and your website and everything. And I just think it's been just so useful to, and really like beneficial to our community to hear. We talk to so many people, we have our guests, but everybody does a different subject and comes at it from a different way. And what always surprises me is that no matter who you speak to, there are always new things. It's like there's never a webinar that I've done in 4.5 years where I've thought, oh, well, this is just another one. There's never an hour where I sit there and go, oh,
Yeah,
can it just be over? And I think that's well, not the beauty of it, but I think it's just very
The
apparent how big FASD is, and
complexity of it.
yeah, the complexities and the needs and the real requirement for professionals like yourself and so many more who are, you know, forging forward with things that are going to really impact families today and in the future. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us
having
tonight.
me.
It's been lovely to meet you. I really would like you to come back again. I think it's been amazing, and I
Yes.
can see there's just like
Sorry, I've
questions.
been typing away for the last 10 minutes. People
I
asking
know,
and
I know.
commenting, and yeah, definitely need to do another webinar. There's so much more, I
There's
think,
so much
to talk
more.
about.
So
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much. Thank you
Thank
everybody for
you.
joining us this evening. Thank you,
Sure.
Maude. It's been amazing. We will share everything. The recording will
Yep.
be up. Yes, we will share
Yep.
the recording. That will probably be up by tomorrow afternoon. It'll be on our YouTube and on
Yep.
our website. It's
Yep.
usually
And
on
if you're in our,
YouTube before our website,
yeah,
but
and we'll put it in the Facebook peer support group as well, so everyone knows that
and
it's up.
anything that Maud sends us, we will share
Mhm.
as well. So
Yes.
and go and buy the book. Go to
Yes.
Amazon, buy the
Buy the
book.
book.
Thanks so much, everybody. Good night. Have a restful and peaceful evening if you can with your young
Yeah.
people.